He was a titan of industry, a man whose name was a synonym for wealth and power. She was a waitress, invisible to men like him, struggling to keep her world from crumbling. In the heart of a glittering city, inside a restaurant that catered to the 1%, their worlds collided over a single carelessly spoken phrase. He thought he was showcasing his worldly culture in his native tongue. He never imagined that the quiet woman refilling his water glass not only understood him, but knew the language better than he did. What follows isn't just the story of a public correction. It's a story of pride secrets and the humbling truth that true worth can be found in the most unexpected of places. The scent of truffle oil and simmering ambition clung to the air at Aria, a restaurant so exclusive that its name was spoken in whispers among the city's elite. For Annalise Rousseau, it mostly smelled of 8-hour shifts and the lingering ache in her feet. She moved between the tables with a practiced grace, her expression a carefully constructed mask of pleasant neutrality. It was a mask she had perfected over the last 2 years, a shield against the casual condescension and entitled demands of her clientele. Each filled water glass, each cleared plate was a small step toward the mountain of medical bills piling up on her small kitchen table. Her life outside these damask-lined walls was a stark contrast. It was a 3rd-floor walk-up that always seemed to be cold, the quiet ticking of a clock measuring the hours between her mother's medication schedules. Maria Russo, once a vibrant woman with a laugh that could fill a room, was now a fragile figure confined to her bed. Her world shrunk to the view from her window. A degenerative neurological condition with a name as cruel as its symptoms was slowly stealing her, and the only hope was an experimental treatment, so astronomically expensive it might as well be on the moon. So Annalise served. She smiled, and she disappeared into the background, becoming just another part of the restaurant's opulent scenery. Her one private act of rebellion, her secret solace, was language. In the cacophony of the kitchen, she could pick out the frantic Spanish of the line cooks. On the street, she'd follow the melodic cadence of a Haitian Creole conversation for a block just to feel the rhythm of it. At Yale, before she'd been forced to drop out, her professors had called her a prodigy. She didn't just learn languages, she inhabited them. They were complex, beautiful systems, living things with histories and secrets. Her mother, whose own parents had come from a small, forgotten village in the Italian Alps, had given her the first one. She'd taught Annalise the soft, lyrical Italian of her childhood, a language of poetry and lullabies, a world away from the standardized textbook version. It was a gift Annalise cherished, a link to a heritage she'd never known, and a mother she was slowly losing. Tonight, the ambition in the air was thicker than usual. The arrival of Donatello Corsini had seen to that. His name preceded him like a shockwave. A self-made tech billionaire, Corsini had clawed his way to the top with a reputation for brutal efficiency and a personality that oscillated between charismatic and tyrannical. He was handsome in a severe way, with sharp, dark eyes that missed nothing and a jaw that looked like it had been carved from granite. He entered Aria not as a guest, but as a conqueror, his 2 business associates trailing in his wake like well-groomed jackals. Annalise had served him before. He was a difficult customer, demanding, impatient, and a notoriously poor tipper for a man who could buy the entire building with the loose change in his custom-made suit. But what truly grated on her was his performative use of Italian. He would pepper his speech with phrases delivered with a flourish and a thick, almost caricatured accent that betrayed a deep disconnect from the language itself. He used it as he used everything else, as a tool, a prop to construct an image of old-world sophistication he clearly felt he lacked. He was the son of immigrants, a fact he seemed to both trade on and resent, and his mangled Italian was the clearest evidence of that internal conflict. "A table with a view of the city's soul," he announced to the matron, his voice loud enough to turn heads. "And bring us the wine of the kings." A clumsy literal translation that made Annalise cringe internally. A native speaker would simply ask for the best vintage, or perhaps a Barolo, with quiet confidence. Corsini's pronouncement was for the benefit of his audience. As Annalise approached their table, her water pitcher held steady, she caught snippets of his conversation. It was a monologue of conquest, a hostile takeover of a smaller firm, a rival Gideon Blackwood who was being put in his place. His companions, a man named Robert and another named Paul, laughed on cue, their faces alight with sycophantic admiration. "This Gideon Blackwood," Corsini said, leaning back as Annalise silently filled his glass. "He thinks his old money gives him class. But he has no sprezzatura." He pronounced it sprezzatura, butchering the delicate word for effortless grace. Annalise's fingers tightened on the pitcher for a fraction of a second. Sprezzatura was a concept from Castiglione's The Book of the Courtier, a subtle art of concealing art, of making the difficult appear easy. The very act of announcing one's possession of it was to prove its absence. It was the linguistic equivalent of explaining a joke. For the next hour, she orbited their table, a silent ghost at the feast of ego. Corsini held court, his voice, a booming instrument of self-aggrandizement. He ordered for the table in his fractured Italian, pointing at the menu and mispronouncing nearly every dish. Gnocchi became gnocchi. Bruschetta became bruschetta. Each misstep was a small needle prick to Annalise's soul. It felt personal, like watching someone take a precious family heirloom and use it as a doorstop. Her friend and fellow waitress, Sophia, caught her eye from across the room, giving a subtle roll of her eyes that said, "Can you believe this guy?" Annalise offered a faint, tired smile in return. It was just a job. The man was a caricature, and his linguistic sins were none of her business. Her business was the rent, the pharmacy bills, the quiet hope that she could earn enough in tips tonight to buy the more expensive nutrient-rich broth her mother's doctor recommended. But as the main courses were cleared, the situation escalated. Flushed with wine and success, Corsini decided to make a toast. He raised his glass, a smirk playing on his lips, as he prepared to deliver what he clearly believed would be a pithy, impressive Italian proverb to cap the evening. "To our victory," he declared, his dark eyes sweeping over his associates. "As my grandfather used to say." He paused for dramatic effect. "The wolf loses its fur, but not its vice." A common enough saying. But then he added his own flourish, a phrase meant to sound profound and poetic. "Because his soul is a mirror for the sky." His guests nodded, looking deeply impressed. Robert even jotted it down on a napkin. Annalise froze mid-step, a stack of plates suddenly feeling impossibly heavy in her hands. A cold dread mingled with an electrifying surge of indignation washed over her. It was one thing to mispronounce a word. It was another thing entirely to speak such utter meaningless gibberish and pass it off as ancestral wisdom. Because his soul is a mirror for the sky. It sounded pretty. It was also completely nonsensical, a string of words with no idiomatic or proverbial meaning whatsoever. It was the kind of phrase a first-year language student might construct, grammatically correct, but culturally void. It was fake. A cheap, glittering imitation of a language she held sacred. And in that moment, something inside Annalise snapped. It wasn't about the job anymore. It wasn't about the tips or the condescension. It was about her mother's lullabies. It was about the centuries of history and poetry he was trampling with his diamond-encrusted boots. It was about the truth. She took a deep, steadying breath, placed the plates on a nearby serving stand, and turned toward the billionaire's table. The mask of the invisible waitress was gone. The universe of Aria seemed to contract, focusing to a single point on table 12. For a moment, Annalise was an observer in her own body, watching herself glide toward Donatello Corsini. Her movements were deliberate, stripped of the subservient deference she usually projected. Sophia shot her a panicked look from the service station, her eyes wide with alarm, but Annalise didn't see it. Her focus was entirely on the man holding a glass of $800 wine, basking in the glow of his own fabricated profundity. She stopped beside his chair, not to refill a glass or clear a dish, but simply to stand. She waited. It took a few seconds for him to notice her presence. He was still smiling, accepting the fawning praise of his companions. "Brilliant, Donatello. Truly brilliant," Paul was saying. "A mirror for the sky. It's so evocative. It speaks to the unchangeable nature of a man's core essence," Corsini elaborated, pleased with himself. He finally registered Annalise standing beside him, her shadow falling over the white tablecloth. His smile tightened into a look of annoyance. "What is it?" he asked, his tone sharp. He didn't look at her instead, examining his wine glass as if it were far more interesting. "We don't need anything." Annalise didn't flinch. Her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs, but her voice, when it came, was unnervingly calm. It was quiet, yet it cut through the low hum of the restaurant like a shard of glass. And she spoke in Italian. Not his clumsy, performative Italian, but the fluid, elegant prose of a native. "Forgive me, sir." She began, her tone respectful but firm. The shift in language was immediate and startling. Corsini's head snapped up. His eyes, which had dismissed her moments before, now fixed on her with sudden, sharp attention. His companions, Robert and Paul, looked confused, their smiles faltering. She continued, her Italian flawless, her accent carrying the subtle melodic undertones of the northern regions, a dialect of authenticity he could never hope to replicate. The first part of the proverb is correct. The wolf loses its fur, but not its vice. It is a well-known saying. A flicker of confusion, then suspicion, crossed Corsini's face. He was being addressed in his supposed mother tongue by a waitress. The power dynamic of the entire room had just been, silently and irrevocably, subverted. She pressed on her gaze, unwavering. But the second phrase, "because his soul is a mirror for the sky." With all due respect, sir, that phrase means nothing. It is not a proverb. It is just a sequence of words. The silence that followed was absolute. It was a dense, heavy thing, more profound than any noise. The clinking of distant cutlery stopped. The low murmur of conversations at other tables seemed to fade away. Corsini's face, which had been flushed with triumph, slowly drained of color. He stared at her, his jaw slack with disbelief. He had been corrected. Not just corrected, but dismantled, in front of his associates, in his own supposed native tongue, by the waitress. Robert and Paul exchanged bewildered glances, their limited grasp of the language failing them. They only understood that something had gone terribly wrong. The atmosphere at the table had turned from celebratory to glacial. Donatello Corsini found his voice, and it was laced with venom. He switched back to English, his words clipped and dangerous. "What did you just say?" Annalise met his furious gaze and replied calmly in English, her voice retaining its quiet authority. "I said that your addendum to the proverb, the part about the soul being a mirror, is not a real saying, sir. I'm sure it was an oversight." She gave him an out, a small, flimsy bridge back to dignity. He didn't take it. His humiliation was too public, too acute. He saw her out for what it was. Pity. And he couldn't stand it. "Who in the hell do you think you are?" he snarled, pushing his chair back slightly. "You think you can embarrass me in front of my guests?" "That was not my intention," Annalise said, her composure beginning to fray under the heat of his anger. "My intention was to prevent the beautiful language of Dante and Petrarca from being misrepresented." The mention of Dante and Petrarca was like throwing fuel on the fire. It highlighted the depth of her knowledge and the shallowness of his. His face darkened with rage. "You're fired!" He spat, his voice low and menacing. He pointed a finger at her. "Get out! I want you out of here now!" "Sir, you don't have the authority," Annalise began, but he cut her off. "I have the authority to buy this entire city block and bulldoze it. I want you fired!" He turned his glare on the restaurant manager, Mr. Harrison, who was now rushing toward the table, his face pale with anxiety. "Mr. Corsini, is there a problem?" Harrison asked, his voice trembling slightly. "This one," Corsini said, gesturing at Annalise with contempt. She insulted me. She's insolent. I want her gone." Mr. Harrison looked from Corsini's thunderous expression to Annalise's pale but resolute face. Annalise was a model employee. Corsini was a patron who spent more in one night than Annalise earned in 6 months. The math was brutal and simple. "Annalise, please go to my office," Harrison said, his voice strained. He was capitulating. Annalise felt a cold knot of despair form in her stomach. The rent, her mother. It had all vanished in a moment of linguistic pride. But before she could move, an unexpected voice intervened. It was the fourth man at the table, one of Corsini's guests, who had remained silent throughout the dinner. He was an older gentleman, impeccably dressed with a quiet air of authority that made Corsini's boisterousness seem cheap by comparison. His name was Lorenzo Vescovi, a fact Annalise knew only from the reservation list. Vescovi cleared his throat softly and spoke his English accented with the unmistakable polish of Roman aristocracy. "Donatello," he said, his voice gentle, but carrying an immense weight. "Leave the girl alone." Corsini turned to him, momentarily speechless. Vescovi looked at Annalise not with pity, but with a glimmer of genuine interest and respect in his tired eyes. He then addressed her, switching to the same pure, elegant Italian she had used. "Miss, your Italian is impeccable. Where does your family come from?" Annalise, startled, replied automatically. "My mother is from a small village near Belluno, sir." Vescovi's eyebrows raised in appreciation. "Ah, the Veneto region. A beautiful dialect. You do your heritage a great honor." He then turned his gaze back to a visibly flustered Donatello Corsini. The public lesson was now complete. Not only had the waitress been proven right, but her linguistic credentials had just been validated by a true Italian patrician. He switched back to English, his tone now holding a hint of ice. "Donatello, a man of true culture, does not need to announce it, and he certainly does not punish someone for speaking the truth, especially when she does so with more grace than he himself displayed." He took a sip of water. "Let us finish our discussion about the Zurich acquisition, and please," he added with a final cutting glance, "let the young lady do her job." The rebuke was devastating. Corsini was trapped. To argue would be to further embarrass himself in front of Vescovi, a potential investor whose respect he desperately needed. To back down was to admit defeat to a waitress. He chose defeat. He slumped back in his chair, his face a mask of cold fury. He waved a dismissive hand at Mr. Harrison. "Fine, whatever. Just get her away from my table." Mr. Harrison nodded quickly, his relief palpable. He gestured for Annalise to leave, which she did with as much dignity as she could muster. As she walked back toward the kitchen, her legs shaking, she could feel Donatello Corsini's eyes burning into her back. It was not over. She hadn't just corrected a man. She had made a very powerful, very wealthy, and very proud enemy. The next few days at Aria were thick with a tension only Annalise seemed to feel. Mr. Harrison treated her with a new nervous respect, as if she were a landmine he had to carefully step around. Sophia was a whirlwind of awe and terror on her behalf. "I can't believe you did that," she whispered, during a lull polishing cutlery with furious energy. "I thought he was going to have you airlifted out of the restaurant and dropped in the ocean. But then that old guy, Vescovi, amazing. It was like a scene from a movie." "It was stupid," Annalise murmured, her gaze drifting toward the front door. "I almost lost my job." "You almost became a legend," Sophia countered. "No one has ever put Donatello Corsini in his place." But Annalise felt no triumph. The fear of that moment lingered, the cold dread of unemployment and its catastrophic consequences for her mother. She had won the battle but felt certain the war was coming. The look on Corsini's face as she walked away promised as much. It wasn't just anger. It was the look of a predator whose prey had unexpectedly bitten back. It was a promise of retribution. She expected him to call the restaurant to use his immense influence to have her fired discreetly. She checked the daily schedule each morning, half expecting her name to be missing. But nothing happened. The silence from the Corsini camp was more unnerving than an open declaration of war. Then, a week after the incident, he returned. He wasn't dining. He came alone and took a seat at the bar, ordering a single glass of whiskey. The bar had a clear view of the entire dining room. Annalise was working the far section, but she felt his presence like a change in atmospheric pressure. She could feel his eyes on her as she took orders, as she carried heavy trays, as she explained the specials to a table of tourists. His gaze was not lecherous or overtly aggressive. It was analytical. It was the unblinking stare of a scientist studying a curious specimen under a microscope. He wanted to understand. How could this woman, this anonymous minimum wage worker, possess a knowledge and poise that had so thoroughly undone him? His world was built on clear hierarchies. Money, power, and influence sat at the top. Service, labor, and obscurity sat at the bottom. She had violated that sacred order. Annalise tried to ignore him, focusing on the small, repetitive tasks of her job. But his presence was a constant, unnerving weight. Sophia noticed it too. "He's staring at you," she hissed as they passed each other near the kitchen. "What do you think he wants?" "I don't know, and I don't want to know," Annalise replied, her jaw tight. Unbeknownst to her, Donatello was already working. The day after the dinner he had made a call, not to the restaurant's owner but to a man named Carter, who ran a private security and investigation firm that catered to the ultra-wealthy. Carter and his team were ghosts capable of retrieving any information, no matter how protected. "I want to know everything about her." Donatello had commanded his voice, cold. The waitress from Aria, Annalise Russo, everything. The first report came back within 48 hours. It was basic. Address in a lower middle-class neighborhood. Sole caregiver for her mother, Maria Russo, who was suffering from corticobasal degeneration. No criminal record. No social media presence. One close friend, Sophia Clark. It was the profile of a nobody, which only deepened the mystery. "Dig deeper," Donatello ordered. "Education. Family history. I want to know where she learned to speak like that." The second report was the one that changed everything. It landed in his secure inbox a few days later, and he read it in his sterile, glass-walled office overlooking the city. Subject: Annalise Marie Russo. Education, Yale University class of 2021. Withdrew. Major linguistics concentration in Romance philology. Academic record: GPA 4.0. recipient of the Benjamin Franklin Fellowship for Language Studies, published a paper in the Yale Review of Linguistics, Phonetic Drift in Pre-Unification Italian Dialects of the Veneto region. Faculty notes described her as brilliant, a generational talent, reason for withdrawal, family medical emergency. Donatello read the report 3 times. Yale. A full fellowship. A published academic paper on the very dialects she had weaponized against him. This wasn't a waitress who happened to speak Italian. This was a world-class linguist masquerading as a waitress. The anger he had felt began to curdle into something else, something far more complex, a grudging, infuriating respect. He was a man who valued excellence, even in his adversaries. He had built his empire by identifying and acquiring top-tier talent, and he had just been publicly humbled by talent he hadn't even recognized. The humiliation remained, but now it was layered with an intense, burning curiosity. The puzzle of Annalise Rousseau was more compelling than any corporate takeover. That was why he was at the bar. He wasn't just watching her serve food. He was watching a fallen academic, a prodigy in exile. He watched her switch seamlessly to fluent, if slightly accented French, to help a pair of diners from Quebec. He watched her patiently use slow, simple English and gestures to assist an elderly Japanese couple, her smile never betraying a hint of impatience. He stayed for 2 hours nursing his single drink, his mind racing. The initial impulse for revenge to crush her, to erase her, seemed crude and unsatisfying now. Firing her would be easy. Forgetting her would be impossible. He needed to understand the story. He needed to know why a Yale prodigy was serving him overpriced pasta instead of lecturing in an Ivy League hall. As the restaurant began to empty out, he finally paid his bill, leaving a $100 tip for the bartender. He walked out into the cool night air, but he didn't head for his waiting car. He crossed the street and stood in the shadows of a darkened storefront, his gaze fixed on the entrance of Aria. He was no longer a customer. He was a hunter, but he was no longer sure if he was hunting for revenge or for answers. He waited. He knew her shift would end soon, and this time the conversation would be on his terms. The end of a shift felt like emerging from a deep-sea dive. Annalise's ears rang with the phantom clatter of plates, and her muscles ached with a familiar bone-deep weariness. She traded her uniform for jeans and a worn sweater in the cramped staff locker room, the brief exchange with Sophia, the only normal part of her evening. "He's gone," Sophia said, pulling on her coat. "He just sat there all night. It was creepy." "Let's just hope he doesn't come back," Annalise said, though she didn't believe it for a second. The intensity of his stare had promised a follow-up. She said her goodbyes and stepped out of the restaurant's back alley entrance, pulling her thin coat tighter against the city's chill. The street was quieter now, the late-night traffic a distant hum. She started her 10-minute walk to the subway station, her mind already shifting to her mother. Did she take her evening medication? Was she feeling any better today? She was halfway down the block when a long black car, sleek and silent as a panther, pulled up beside her. The passenger window glided down, revealing Donatello Corsini sitting in the back seat. The ambient light of the streetlights cast his face in sharp angles and deep shadows. Annalise's heart leaped into her throat. She froze her hand, clutching the strap of her tote bag. This was it. The confrontation she had been dreading. "Get in, Ms. Rousseau," he said. It wasn't a request. "I don't think so," she replied, her voice steadier than she felt. She started walking again, her pace quickening. The car kept pace with her effortlessly. "We can have this conversation on the sidewalk where your friend Sophia can watch from the corner, and the kitchen staff can get a nice view, or we can have it in private. Your choice." She glanced back. He was right. Sophia was lingering by the alley, her expression a mask of concern. Annalise stopped defeated. She knew a public scene would only bring more trouble down on her and the restaurant. With a deep, resentful sigh, she walked to the car and opened the door, sliding onto the plush leather seat opposite him. The door shut with a heavy final thud, sealing her inside the silent, opulent world of Donatello Corsini. The car didn't move. The chauffeur was a statue, separated by a pane of privacy glass. The interior smelled of leather and a faint, expensive cologne. It was a cage, albeit a gilded one. "What do you want, Mr. Corsini?" she asked, looking straight ahead, refusing to meet his eyes. "I want to know who you are," he said, his voice quiet, devoid of the anger she expected. It was replaced by that same unnerving, analytical curiosity she'd felt from the bar. "You already have my name." "I have more than your name," he countered. He picked up a slim tablet from the seat beside him. Annalise Marie Russo, born in Hartford, Connecticut. Father a history professor deceased. Mother Maria Russo unemployed due to health reasons. You were a linguistics major at Yale, a prodigy according to your professors. You published a paper on Veneto dialects. Then 2 years ago you dropped off the face of the earth. You traded an Ivy League library for a tray of breadsticks. The question isn't who you are, Ms. Russo. The question is why. Annalise felt a cold wave of violation wash over her. He had dug into her life, peeled back the layers she kept so carefully hidden. Her academic past, her family's pain, it was all just data on a screen for him. "My life is none of your business," she said, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and rage. "You made it my business when you decided to lecture me in my own restaurant." He shot back a flash of the old arrogance returning. He put the tablet down. "Look, I'm not here to fight. I'm here to understand. A mind like yours. It doesn't belong on a restaurant floor. It's a waste." "It pays the bills," she said bitterly. "Something my Yale fellowship couldn't do." The raw truth of the statement hung in the air between them. For the first time, a flicker of something other than pride or curiosity crossed his face. It was a glimmer of understanding. He was a man who understood transactional realities. He leaned forward slightly. "Your mother, corticobasal degeneration. It's rare, aggressive. The standard treatments are palliative at best. They manage the symptoms, but the decline is inevitable." Annalise finally turned to look at him, her eyes flashing with fury. "How dare you?" she whispered. "How dare you speak about her?" "I know about it because my company invested in a biotech firm 3 years ago that was trying to find a cure for a similar set of neurodegenerative disorders," he said, his tone becoming purely practical. "They failed. But another company, a rival of mine, has had a breakthrough, Blackwood Neuro, run by Gideon Blackwood." The name landed like a stone in the pit of her stomach. Gideon Blackwood, the man Corsini had been talking about at dinner, his rival. "They've developed a new gene therapy treatment." Corsini continued, his eyes locked on hers. "BN301. It's shown incredible results in early trials. It doesn't just manage symptoms. In some cases, it has halted the progression of the disease entirely." Annalise stared at him, her mind reeling. She spent her nights scouring the internet for any shred of hope, any new trial or experimental drug. She knew about BN301. It was her holy grail, the impossible miracle she prayed for. She also knew that the Phase 2-2 trial was closed. It was limited to a handful of patients, all selected, all funded. There was no way in. "The trial is full," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "The waiting list is years long. The cost, even if you could get in, is—" She trailed off the number too immense to even voice. "The cost is irrelevant," he said dismissively. "And lists are for people who wait. I don't wait." He paused, letting the weight of his statement settle in the small space. Gideon Blackwood and I are competitors in a very aggressive market. We are currently bidding for a massive government contract to overhaul the federal data infrastructure. The deciding vote belongs to a consortium of foreign investors. He leaned back against the leather, the trap now fully set. This is what I want, Ms. Russo. I want you to tell me your story. The real one. Not the data on my screen. And then I'm going to make you an offer. An offer that has to do with Gideon Blackwood, a consortium of investors, and a slot in a clinical trial that as of this morning didn't exist. Annalise looked at his face, at the cold, calculating intelligence in his eyes. He wasn't offering charity. This was a transaction. He had discovered her one vulnerability, the single pressure point that could make her do anything. He was leveraging her mother's life. The realization was sickening, but beneath the disgust, a tiny, treacherous spark of hope ignited. It was a devil's bargain offered by a man she despised. But it was also the only lifeline she had seen in 2 years. The silence in the car stretched thick with the weight of Donatello's proposition. Annalise's mind was a battlefield. One side raged with indignation at his methods, the intrusive investigation, the cold-blooded leveraging of her mother's illness. The other side was a desperate, drowning voice that whispered of hope, of a chance she never thought she would have. Pride against desperation, contempt against love. My story, she finally said, her voice raspy. You have the file. You know the story. I know the facts. Donatello corrected his gaze, intense. I don't know the why. I don't know what it feels like to be the smartest person in a room and have to pretend you're not. I want to hear it from you. Perhaps it was the exhaustion or the sudden dizzying possibility of a cure, but the walls she had so carefully constructed began to crumble. She told him. She spoke of the joy of her studies, the thrill of deciphering ancient texts, the world of history and meaning that opened up to her through language. She described the phone call that had shattered that world, the diagnosis, the prognosis, the dawning horror of the costs. She explained the decision to leave Yale not as a sacrifice, but as a necessity. Her father's pension was modest, their savings non-existent. The only thing of value she had was her ability to work. I didn't want my mother to feel like a burden, she said, her voice low, the confession costing her more than he could ever know. I wanted her to see me working, to see that I was okay, so she wouldn't give up. She didn't look at him as she spoke, instead focusing on her own hands, twisting the worn strap of her bag. When she finished, a heavy quiet returned to the car. She braced herself for a dismissive comment, for a simple, I see, before he moved on to the transactional part of his speech. Instead, he said something that caught her completely off guard. My father worked in a steel mill for 40 years. He said, his voice softer, more reflective than she'd ever heard it. He came to this country with nothing. He saved every penny to send me to school. He wanted me to have a life where my hands stayed clean. When he got sick, he refused to let me pay for his care. He said he hadn't worked his whole life just to take money from his son. I had to set up a blind trust funneled through a charity, just so he would accept it, without knowing it came from me. He looked away out at the darkened city street. Pride is a complicated thing, Ms. Russo. It was the first genuine crack she had seen in his armor of arrogance, a moment of shared experience that resonated in the space between them. For a fleeting second, he wasn't the billionaire tyrant. He was the son of an immigrant, burdened by the same fierce, complicated love she felt. The moment passed. He turned back to her, his expression all business once more. As I said, Gideon Blackwood and I are at war. The final piece of the data infrastructure contract comes down to a meeting next week in Lake Como. The key investors are a Swiss-German banking family, the Krausers. Patriarch, 2 sons. They are old money. They value tradition, culture, discretion, all the things Gideon Blackwood pretends to have. He paused. They also have a linguistic quirk. The father Friedrich insists on conducting the early stages of any major negotiation in his native tongue, Romansch. Annaliese's eyes widened slightly. Romansch, a Rhaeto-Romance language spoken by only a few tens of thousands of people in a single canton of Switzerland. It was obscure, complex, and notoriously difficult. It was also one of the languages she had focused on in a seminar on linguistic isolation. It's a power play. Donatello continued, seeing he had her attention. A shibboleth. He uses it to gauge his potential partners to see if they've done their homework, if they respect his culture. Gideon Blackwood has hired a team of translators from Zurich. He thinks that will be enough. It won't be. Friedrich Krauser doesn't want a translator. He wants to be understood. He wants a connection. Now the offer came into sharp focus. You want me to be your translator? No, Donatello said flatly. I already have translators. I want you to be my liaison, my cultural attaché. I need you to do more than just change words from Romansch to English. I need you to read the room. I need you to understand the nuance, the subtext, the proverbs, the real ones. He added a wry, self-deprecating twist on his lips. I need you to give me the edge that Gideon Blackwood's team of sterile academics can't provide. I need your mind, Ms. Rousseau, the one from Yale. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a near whisper. You do this for me. You help me win this contract and cripple Blackwood's company, and I will do more than get your mother a spot in the trial. Gideon Blackwood will personally call your mother's doctor and demand she be included. I will acquire a minority stake in his company, a concession of his defeat, and use that leverage to ensure she receives the best care indefinitely. I will solve your problem, permanently. The sheer audacity of the offer was breathtaking. He wasn't just offering help, he was offering total victory, a fantasy solution to an impossible problem. And the price was to align herself with him, to become a weapon in his corporate war. She would have to use her most precious gift, the love of language her mother had given her, as a tool for a man she found repellent. Why me? She asked the question genuine. You could find another linguist. Because I've seen you work, he said, and there was no flattery in his tone, only cold fact. I saw you at the restaurant. You're not just smart. You have poise under pressure. You have nerve. And, he added, his eyes glinting, you have a very powerful motivation. I don't trust people who work for money. Their loyalty can be bought. I trust people who are fighting for something they can't afford to lose. He was right. He had dissected her, understood her, and now he was offering her the only deal she couldn't possibly refuse. Her pride, her anger, her resentment, they were all luxuries. Her mother's life was a necessity. There are conditions, she said, finding a strength she didn't know she possessed. Donatello raised an eyebrow, intrigued. First, Annalise said, her voice clear and strong, I am not your employee. I am a consultant. You will treat me as such. Second, everything is in writing. A contract drafted by my own lawyer outlining your exact obligations regarding my mother's care to be signed before we leave. He gave a slow, impressed nod. Done. Third, she continued, I will need access to all your files on the Krausers and Gideon Blackwood. Everything. I will not walk into this blind. "You'll have it all by morning," he confirmed. She took a deep breath, the final condition, the hardest to voice. "And you will never, ever use my family, my past, or my mother against me again. This is a professional arrangement. Once it is concluded, we are done." Donatello Corsini looked at her for a long moment, a complex expression on his face. It was respect, hard-earned and absolute. "You have my word, Ms. Russo," he said. "Welcome to the team." He tapped on the privacy glass. The car purred to life, pulling away from the curb to drive her home. Annalise stared out the window at the city lights, streaking past the reality of what she had just done, crashing down on her. She had made a pact with the devil, but for the first time in 2 years, the terrifying, suffocating darkness of her life was pierced by a single brilliant ray of hope. The flight to Italy was a surreal transition. One moment, Annalise was in her cramped apartment, explaining to her worried mother that she had an incredible short-term consulting opportunity. The next, she was seated in the cream-colored leather of a private jet, a mountain of research files on the table in front of her, as Donatello Corsini worked silently on his laptop opposite her. The air crackled with a new dynamic. They were colleagues, not combatants. Annalise dove into the work, her mind alight with a kind of academic fervor she hadn't felt since leaving Yale. She absorbed the history of the Krauser family, their business dealings, their personal tastes. And she immersed herself in Romansh, not just the grammar, but its soul, its idioms, its deep connection to the isolated valleys from which it sprang. Their destination was a villa on the shores of Lake Como, a place of such breathtaking beauty it seemed unreal. Donatello's villa was a masterpiece of old-world architecture and modern minimalism. For 2 days they worked relentlessly. Annalise found herself impressed by Donatello's sharp intellect and his tireless work ethic. He listened to her insights not with the condescension of a boss, but with the focus of a strategist. He was learning to trust her judgment. In turn, Annalise began to see past the caricature of the arrogant billionaire. She saw a man driven by a deep-seated insecurity, a relentless need to prove himself, born from the steel mills of his father's past. He was disciplined, brilliant, and she began to realize profoundly lonely. During a late-night work session, she mentioned her mother's village near Belluno, and for a moment he spoke of his own family's origins in Calabria, the two of them connecting briefly over the shared, distant landscapes of their heritage. The line between them was blurring, the simple categories of good and bad becoming insufficient. The day of the meeting arrived. It was held at the Krausers' ancestral estate, a fortress-like mansion perched on a cliff overlooking the lake. Annalise, dressed in a simple but elegant suit Donatello's assistant had provided, felt a tremor of anxiety. Her mother's future hinged on what would happen in the next few hours. They were shown into a grand wood-paneled library. Friedrich Krauser and his 2 sons, Stefan and Klaus, rose to greet them. Friedrich was an imposing man, with shrewd, pale blue eyes. As Donatello had predicted, after the initial pleasantries in English, Friedrich switched seamlessly to Romansh. "It is our custom to begin in the language of our valley," he said, his voice gravelly. "Welcome to our home." Gideon Blackwood, already present with his team, smirked. His own translator, a stiff-looking man from Zurich, stepped forward and began to relay the words in a flat, formal English. Donatello simply nodded to Annalise. She stepped forward slightly, her heart pounding. She met Friedrich Krauser's gaze and replied in flawless melodic Romansh. Her accent carefully tuned to the specific sub-dialect of his native Sur-Sylvan. "You have a magnificent home. The view over the lake is truly inspiring." The effect was electric. Friedrich Krauser's stern expression softened into one of genuine surprise and delight. His sons exchanged impressed glances. Gideon Blackwood's smirk vanished, replaced by a scowl. His translator looked utterly stunned. The conversation continued with Annalise acting as a fluid, intuitive bridge. She didn't just translate Donatello's words. She reshaped his aggressive business speak into the more nuanced, respectful language the Krausers valued. When Donatello spoke of market disruption, she translated it using a Romansh idiom about changing river currents. She was not a machine. She was an artist, painting a picture of partnership and mutual respect. Donatello, to his credit, understood what she was doing and followed her lead, softening his approach. They were making undeniable progress. The atmosphere was warming. Then Gideon Blackwood, seeing the deal slipping away, decided to intervene. A remarkable performance. Blackwood said, his English voice slick with insinuation, as he interrupted a point Annalise was making. "Your assistant is very talented, Donatello. But one must wonder if this is genuine respect for culture or simply a well-rehearsed parlor trick." He then turned to Annalise, a cruel smile on his face. "Tell me, young lady, what does a waitress from the city know of the old ways?" The insult was designed to rattle her, to expose her as a fraud. Donatello stiffened, ready to leap to her defense, but Annalise held up a hand, a gesture so subtle it was almost invisible. She would handle this herself. She turned to face Gideon Blackwood, her expression calm. And then she did something no one expected. She looked past Blackwood to one of his own associates, a quiet man who had been sitting in the corner all morning. Throughout the meeting, Annalise had noticed him speaking in low tones to Blackwood. His accent was Italian, but with a specific, harsh cadence she couldn't initially place. But then he used a local phrase meaning, "Let's go eat," and everything suddenly made sense. It was the dialect of a specific isolated valley in the Cottian Alps, a region known for its insular and notoriously cunning traders. A region her own great-grandfather had fled after a bad business deal a century ago. Annalise addressed the man directly, but she spoke in the crisp standard Italian she had used to correct Donatello. "Sir, you are from Piedmont, are you not? Perhaps from the Maira Valley." The man looked up, utterly shocked that she had identified his origin so precisely. Annalise then switched to the man's own obscure dialect, a language she knew only from her great-grandmother's stories of swindlers and cheats. Her accent was perfect. Why would a gentleman like Mr. Blackwood take advice from someone from Billionaire? She named a specific village in the valley with a reputation for producing tricksters. The associate's face went white. Friedrich Krauser, a shrewd man who knew the reputations of his neighboring Italian regions, leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. He understood the implication immediately. Annalise pressed her advantage, turning back to Krauser and speaking in Romansh again. "Signor Krauser, Mr. Blackwood's proposal speaks of a guaranteed profit margin. It is a very optimistic projection. The people of the Valmyra have a saying," she said, her voice now cool and clear. "Never trust a man who sells you the winter sun." It was a brilliant, devastating move. She hadn't just insulted Blackwood, she had used deep, authentic cultural knowledge to expose his entire proposal as a dubious scheme, linking him to a region notorious for deception, all while validating her own credentials beyond any doubt. She had used language not as a parlor trick, but as a scalpel to reveal the truth. Gideon Blackwood was speechless. His associate from Bennett looked like he wanted the floor to swallow him whole. Friedrich Krauser stood up. He looked at Blackwood with cold disdain, then turned to Donatello with a look of newfound respect. He spoke in English for all to hear. "Mr. Corsini," he said, his voice decisive, "it seems you are a man who surrounds himself with people of substance. Let us discuss the final terms of our partnership." The war was over. 2 weeks later, Annalise stood by her mother's hospital bed. Maria Russo was sleeping peacefully, the first dose of BN 301 already administered. The doctors were optimistic. It was working. Donatello had been true to his word, and then some. The contract was ironclad, her mother's care secured for life. Her consultancy was over. She had a check in her bank account with enough zeros to ensure she would never have to serve another entitled billionaire again. She was free. There was a soft knock on the door. It was Donatello. He wasn't wearing an expensive suit, just a simple cashmere sweater and trousers. He looked tired but content. "I came to see how she was," he said quietly. "She's resting," Annalise replied, a genuine, uncomplicated gratitude in her voice. "Thank you, Donatello." "It was you who won that contract, Annalise, not me," he said. "The offer I made you at the beginning of all this, it still stands. I need people like you." Annalise looked from his face to her mother's. The world had opened up before her. She could go back to Yale. She could do anything. But the journey she had just taken with this complicated, infuriating, and surprisingly honorable man had changed her. "I'll think about it," she said. And for the first time, it wasn't a dismissal. It was a possibility. He simply nodded, understanding that he had no more power over her. Any choice she made now would be her own. He turned to leave, but paused at the door. "Be careful, Annalise," he said softly, in perfect, unpretentious Italian. "Be well, Annalise," she replied with a small smile. "You too, Donatello." He left, and Annalise sat by her mother's side, the quiet hum of the hospital machinery, a lullaby of a future she had never dared to imagine. A future she had earned, not with a serving tray, but with the power of her own voice. What a journey. From the hushed floors of an elite restaurant to the high-stakes world of corporate warfare, Annalise's story is a powerful reminder that our greatest strengths often lie hidden, waiting for the right moment to be revealed. She didn't just correct a billionaire's grammar. She corrected a power imbalance, reclaimed her own destiny, and in doing so saved the person she loved most. It shows that intelligence, integrity, and courage are a currency more valuable than any bank account. Their story is far from over, but this chapter proves that sometimes the most unexpected connections can forge the most incredible futures. If Annalise's story of quiet strength and unexpected triumph resonated with you, please give this video a like and share it with someone who loves a story about the underdog coming out on top. And don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell for more real-life dramas and inspiring tales. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below.